Hello, welcome to another Q&A live on White Lady Gardening and Worm Farm. I must apologize for being late. I got a phone call just as I was about to start the live, so it was an important call, so I could not turn it down. So my apologies for being late. Hi, Han White, how are you? I hope you're all doing well. Yes, so today we are going to talk about a lot of different things, but one of the things that I want to talk about is what do you do when your bin is overpopulated? So there are a few choices that can be made. So if you are a worm farmer and you'd like to share what you do when your worm bin is overpopulated, then that would be awesome. Okay, you're doing well. That's good. Right. So when you find that your bin is, oh, I'm doing well too, Han. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Yeah, so when you find that your worm bin is overpopulated, some may choose to just let it be, some may choose to create more bins. Now, there are several reasons why some might not want to create new bins, and there are reasons why some may not be able to create new bins. Sometimes having enough space to put the bin, especially if you live in a region where most of the time or all of the time your worm bin is going to have to be indoors, then for that reason, some may choose not to create more worm bins. And then sometimes, whether physical limitation, being busy with other responsibilities and stuff like that, they might not be able to take care of a lot of worm bins. So, for that reason, some may choose not to create a new worm bin when their bin is overpopulated. Hi, CC, how are you? I just finished putting your prize, packaging your prize. The only unfortunate thing is that I was having some internet issues and the company came and changed out whatever, and now our printer is saying that it is connected to the devices, but we can't seem to print. So now I don't, I'm not able to print the information to send off your gift. I might have to do it by hand. Yeah, so it's a bit delayed. Yeah, so back to when there is too much worms in your worm bin. So there are several reasons. Sometimes there are those who worm farm, but they're just doing it to use up whatever food scraps they have available around the home and whatever garden refuse they may have. So if they're not producing a lot, even if the population is growing, then they might choose not to create more worm bins. So there are lots of reasons why people may choose not to create more worm bin. However, if you find that you have the time, you have the space, and you don't mind having more than one or several worm bins to look after, then if your bin is overpopulated, it might be a good idea to separate them. Let's see. Cece says, that's okay. Thank you very much. And I know I'm going to like it. Okay, good. Yes, I make sure I wrapped those grow lights so much with I wrapped those grow lights to ensure that they do not get damaged. Excuse me, just a minute. Where's the wrong thing? Oh, I'm on. Yes, my apologies. I don't know why. Seem today is the day when everyone chooses to call me at the wrong time. Yes. No, I don't even remember what I was saying. Do you remember what I was saying? Yeah. So one of the things, if you decide that you are not going to create a new worm bin, you don't need to worry about the worm bin, because even though the bin is overpopulated, with time the worms are going to start regulating the rate at which they reproduce. And when they start to do that, then they will control the amount of worms that are actually in the bin. So you don't have to worry about the bin being overcrowded for long. It won't remain that way. So, what do you guys do when you find that your bin is becoming overpopulated? Do you separate them, or do you just let them stay? And if you find yourself in a situation where you have too much worms, you don't want to create a new bin, one of the things that you can do is to find someone who would like the extra worms that you have. Sometimes you'll find people who are willing to pay for it, or sometimes you can just give it to someone who wants it if you don't want to sell it to them. But really, if you don't want to have more bins, then you don't have to worry about the worm population because they will regulate it. So for those of you who do worm farming, let's see, Han says, I tend to create a new bin. Okay, good. Yeah, so for those of you who do worm farming, do you find that your worms produce enough castings for you to use during your growing season? Or do you find that they're not producing enough castings for you? So far, I have been fortunate where even though I keep extending the size of my garden, my worms have been producing far more than I am able to use, which I'm thankful for. I'd rather have more than have less. Let's see. Okay, they produce more than enough. That is good. That is good. Yeah, so one of the things, sometimes the worms produce more than enough, and we have limited space to store our castings. That can be a bummer sometimes, especially if you're going to be creating more worm bins. And so, what a lot of people will do is give away the extra castings, or they might choose to sell it. But one of the things, if you find that you don't have a lot of space where you can store your castings, a good way to ensure that you use as little space as possible, but you still get to store your castings, is to stock it. So rather than having it in large containers, you could probably put them in buckets. So, for example, 5-gallon buckets, and you just stack them on top of one another, because what is going to happen is that you're going to have the castings for the next growing season, but it's not taking up a lot of space. You want to make sure, of course, that you keep those castings moist, because if not, then your microbes will die off, and you don't really want that to happen either. But there's no harm in giving it away if you don't mind doing so, especially because one of the things about worms producing casting is that when you start out with your worms, that is when you're going to have the least amount of castings. And then as the worms keep on producing, you're just constantly going to be having more and more and more. So in that case, if you don't want to sell it, then you can always give it away, because there are always a lot of gardeners around you. And for those who do the worm farming, but then they find that the worms are not producing the castings fast enough, if you just get started, chances are you might have to wait between 3 to 6 months, depending on how many worms you start with, and how the conditions in the bin. Within 3 to 6 months, you should be able to harvest castings. Now, if you want the worms to produce more in a shorter period of time, one of the things that you can do is make it a lot easier for the worms to consume the food that you are giving them. So, freezing and thawing the food before giving it to them is one way to ensure that they can consume the food faster. Adding roughage or grit to the food that you're giving them is another way to ensure that they can digest the food faster, because, as you know, the worms don't have teeth, so they are not able to chew the food and help to digest it faster. But when you give them the grit, then the grit will help them to process the food. Hi, Helpy. I'm doing okay. How are you? Yeah, so the worms have gizzard like chickens. They have gizzard, and the grit in the gizzard will help to crush the food so that they can digest it faster. Another thing that you can do to ensure that the worms eat faster is to either finely chop the food scraps or blend it. That if you don't want to go through those process, one or another means that you can use, which can be more expensive because a lot of gardeners just want to feed food scraps to their worms. But if you don't have an issue with doing so, then things like cornmeal, powdery form, once it is in the powdery form, so whether cornmeal or oats or stuff like that, those are easy for your worms to consume. Or feeding worm chow, those are easy for your worms to consume. So if you want your worms to eat faster, to produce enough castings for you to have by the growing season start, then consider doing the things that will help the worms to eat the food scraps faster. Let's see, Help Pieces, doing better, thank you. Just fed large feeding to my worms last night to heat up the bin and clear space in my freezer. Okay, good. Yes, I have been putting some food in. I have some food that I put in my freezer for the worms. And now that the time is cold outside and freezing, I'm taking them out and storing them outside because my freezer cannot hold anything else. So I'm thankful for the outdoor freezer. So now every time I have food scraps and it is more than the worms are able to keep up with, then I just parcel them out. And I try to parcel them out in whatever serving I'm going to be giving the worms, because I don't really want to have to wait very long time for this bulky stuff to thaw out before I can give it to the worms. So I try to package them just in per feeding size. So is it cold enough outdoors, LP, where you can actually freeze your food scraps outdoors, or do you still have to be putting them in the freezer during the winter? Yeah, so what do you do when you want to fatten your worms? There are some of us who don't really care about fattening the worms, but then there are some worm farmers who want to see their worms looking nice and fat. And if the person is one who does commercial worm farm, then you want to see those worms looking nice and fat. Now, one of the things that I've learned from experience is that having um, the adequate amount of moisture in your bin does help to keep them fat. So, with that said, the advantage of feeding food scraps to your worms that contain lots of liquid will help to keep them fat. But then they will look fat, but how nourished are they in comparison to if you're using moisture as a mean of fattening them? I don't know what it is if the body absorb a lot of the moisture, but for some reason, when worms are in conditions where there is reasonable amount of moisture, they tend to be fat. And that was the case when I had my hydroponic system and I had a pound of red wrigglers in there. Those are the fattest red wrigglers I've seen to date. And they were not fed nearly as much as I feed the other worms that are grown naturally. But those that were in the hydroponic system, they were just huge fat worms. So I know that moisture play a lot, an important role in fattening your worms. The next thing that you want to do is consider the type of food that you're giving your worms. So even you're going to continue feeding them your food scraps, but in addition to that, you might want to add things like bran or oatmeal or cornmeal, stuff like that, whole milk powder. These things will help to fatten up your worms. So if you have a short period of time and you want to fatten up your worms, then this is one of the things that you can do. Let's see. LP says, I can keep stuff outdoors too. I was thinking about that last night. I could just keep frozen scraps frozen in my outdoor compost bin. Okay, yeah, that would be a good place to store it. Now, I was doing a little bit of research because twice I found mice in my worm bin, in one of my worm bin. They had their little babies in there. And so I wanted to know, do mice really eat worms? Because previous research that I did said that rats will eat worms but not mice, but that the rats, sorry, the worms will get killed in the process as the mice eat the food scraps from your bin. So I did some additional research and it turns out that mice do eat worms. So you want to try and keep mice out of your worm bin. So what can you do to repel them, because you don't want them going in there in the first place? So it is recommended that you bury your food scraps deep into the worm bin. Now, not all worm bins are deep. And even if they are deep, mice can smell the food scraps from far away, but the deeper they are, the better. Mine are shallow. So, what we want to do is to keep the mice away rather than having to deal with them once they are there. So, to repel them, you can use things like eucalyptus oil, peppermint oil, any form of essential oil that has a really strong flavor or scent, I should say. Yes, so any type of essential oil that has a really strong scent will help to repel mice. Um, you can also use Irish Spring. Now, there is conflicting information where that is concerned, because there are those who say they use Irish Spring and the mice eat it, and then there are those who say the Irish Spring works. So not just any bar of soap will work. The reason why Irish Spring is effective in repelling mice is because of the strong scent that it carries. Mice do not like strong scent, and I'm guessing that would be the same for a lot of small rodents as well. They don't like strong scent, so you can use these to repel them. So if you are thinking of using Irish Spring to repel mice and other pests, then it is recommended that you do a test first. So what you can do is just get a small piece of the soap, the Irish Spring, and put it in the region where you know that the mice like to travel, and keep on watching it to see if you see any bite marks in it. If you see bite marks in it, then the chances are it will not work to repel the mice. But if you don't see bite marks, then go ahead and spread it all over in your area where you have your worm bin. The good thing is that it does not only repel mites and other rodents, it repels other types of pests too. So if you have your worm bin in locations where you may have issues with pests, then this might be a good way to keep them away. Now, one of the things though is that the bar, the Irish Spring bar, might last a long time if you have it somewhere where it's not being rained on, of course. But for the peppermint and the eucalyptus and others, it will last a good while. You want to soak it in a piece of cotton or sprinkle a few drops of it. Using the pure oil, essential oil, is better than using the ones that's not very pure, because the pure ones usually have a stronger scent, so they tend to last longer. You soak it in a piece of cotton ball and you place them all over. So you want to make sure that wherever those mice go, the scent is just too much for them to handle. But you don't want to do it where it overwhelms you. So keep that in mind as well. Let's see, LP says, good info about the hydroponics. Sometimes I have a little bit of water, too much I know, on the bottom of my bin. I always find lots of worms living down there. Okay. Now the thing about the worms in the if you have worms in your catchment tray is that worms can live for a good little while in the water, but then they will die eventually, unless of course you have that liquid aerated constantly, because without the liquid being aerated, what is going to happen is that there won't be any air pockets in the water for the worms to breathe. And if they can't breathe naturally, then they are going to die. So they can be in the water, but you don't want them to be in there for too long. Let's see. And says this very good information. This is very informative. I do like the info about repelling rodents. Okay, good. I'm glad you like the information. Yeah, so these are some of the ways that you can repel mice, and you can use bait to bait them away from the location as well. So everybody knows that they love cheese, they love peanut butter and stuff like that. So you can put these in location that is going to draw them away from. The downside of that is that once they smell it, they are going to be prone to be in that vicinity, and it's going to bring them a little bit closer to your worms. So rather than just baiting them away, I'd recommend setting traps using these baits rather than just the baits alone, because you don't want to do anything that is going to draw them anywhere close to where you have your worms. The next thing that you can do to keep them out of your worm bin is ensure that you have covers that are tight enough for tight enough to keep them out, but at the same time has enough ventilation so that your bin can breathe properly. LP says, I don't drain through the bottom. When I find water in the bottom, I add more paper or cardboard until it's all soaked up. Okay. Yes, I guess that's another way of doing it. Works well, go for it. Yeah, so as I was saying regarding the essential oils that you can use to repel the mice, if you're going to use those, you may need to replace them. You will need to replace them from time to time. So keep an eye on that, because you don't want to have the scent all gone and then the mice creep in. So you have to keep an eye on that to see, make sure that it is still effective. So for those of you who have worm castings and your worms produce more than you actually need, how do you store your castings? What do you do with the extra castings? I don't really have to worry about the extra castings too much. I do still end up with extra castings even though I'm selling my castings. But in general, I don't really have to worry too much, because If I don't sell it this year, it won't, next year it will be sold. So, but for you who do not sell your worm castings, what do you do with it? Do you store it? And if you're storing it, do you try to use the ones that you produced the previous years first? Or it doesn't really matter to you which you use first? For worm castings, it is said that it has a shelf life of 3 years. And naturally, with anything that has a shelf life, the first year it's going to be the most potent. And as the years go by, each year that passes, it's less potent. So you want to use it up as quickly as you possibly can. But 3 years is the shelf life of the worm castings. Now, if you've had your worm castings for 3 years, I'd still recommend not throwing it out, but putting it into your garden because it can be used as soil. It might not have all the microbes and all the nutrients that it would normally have, but it still can serve as soil and it still may have some amount of nutrients in there. So, putting it in the garden might be a good way to use it up. And there is nothing wrong with putting the excess castings that you have into your garden. So if you don't have space to store it, just put it into your garden, because the benefit of having it into your garden is that it's going to help with the aeration of your garden. It's going to help with the root, making the root of your plants stronger. It is going to help with retaining the moisture that is in your garden. It is going to help to prevent soil erosion in your garden. So you cannot add too much worm castings to your garden, whereas you can add too much fertilizer or too much compost to your garden. You cannot add too much castings to your garden. So if you find yourself with too much and you don't have space to store it, then just put it out into your garden. Yes, and then because it has the pest repelling properties, that is another reason why you may want to have it in your garden. If you live in areas where you experience cold winters, then the microbes that are there may die off, but at the same time, it still has its nutrients and it still has its moisture retaining properties. The only negative is that the microbes won't make it, but it still has all the other benefits. So when you find yourself with excess, put it in your garden, work it into the soil. If you are someone who cultivate your soil, or should I say till the soil, yes, then work it into, if not, just put it on the surface of your garden and you're good to go. And then when you're ready to sow your seeds, if you're direct sowing your seeds, because it is worm casting and it has the ability to help seeds to germinate, it offers protection from some pests while the seed is germinating and help the seeds to germinate. So putting the excess in your garden will be beneficial. Let's see. LP says, I've got extra right now in 5 gallon buckets. I slowly get worms out as I can. I think I'll just keep them in the buckets and stir it up ever so often. Everything will get used in the garden in spring. Okay. And Han says she used the older ones first. Okay. LP is asking Han if she stores a lot of castings. Yeah, so that is a good point, LP, about stirring your castings. I try to do that as much as is possible as well, because you know that you don't really want your castings to dry out, because when your castings dry out, that is another way of killing the microbes that are in the castings, which you don't want to do. So it is recommended that you keep the castings moist. But sometimes we look at the castings, the surface of the castings might be dry when we're storing it. and so we might add more moisture to it. But if you actually look under the bottom, if you were to stir it, you'd realize that the bottom sometimes can be very moist. Sometimes it can be too moist too if you keep on adding water to the surface. It can end up with the bottom being too moist. So, like you said, healthy stirring it does work. So sometimes rather than adding the moisture, you might want to stir it, mix in the surface. And then the other thing is that when you stir it like that, you are encouraging all of the casting to maintain the same quality. So it's not where those on the top is drying out and losing the microbes while the bottom is rich in microbes. So stirring it helps to keep the castings values balanced. Let's see, and says sometimes yes, at the moment I've got a lot. Okay, good. My castings always dry out on the top layer. At the bottom, it stays moist. Yes, because the top part is getting here. So what I started doing in recent times is to cover the containers that has the castings in it. Now, the containers that I store my casting in, they do not come with covers. So I have to be putting plastic on top, or sometimes it's just paper. But even though it's just paper, it still helps to keep in some of the moisture. But I try to keep it covered, but I don't cover it so tight that it cannot get air, because that too is important for the microbes and beneficial insects that are in the castings. It needs air. So, and then if you have the moisture in there and it does not get air, it too can become anaerobic, because when you process your castings and you sift it out, chances are that maybe 95% of your casting is castings, but then there might be the food scraps that are small particles that are in there. So those things can encourage the thing to go anaerobic. So you might want to ensure that you have the air in there to keep those beneficial insects going. Let's see. And says, I've got worms in my raised beds. So what the worms produce in the bins are always more than what I need. Okay, yes. I guess that makes sense. And in your region, it seems as if the worms are dime a dozen in the soil there. Your soil must be pretty healthy. You could actually go without having a worm farm and have your garden being as healthy as ever, which is awesome. Yes, I wish I had a lot of native worms here like that. We Depending on where you are, because like people who live on acreages and stuff, people who raise horses or cattle or whatever, they tend to have a lot of African night crawlers in this cold region here, right? They tend to have a lot of the Canadian night crawlers and regular earthworms in their soil. But like in the city here, that is not the case. If you are someone who is always adding organic matter to your garden, then you will have a reasonable amount of worms. I grow in my own. Yes, I'm having a good year so far. How about you? Oh, congrats on getting your Airbnb up and going. Yes, so, oh, and White says she doesn't really need the worm bins. Yes, but in my region, when I first came here, my soil was fertile because when I first planted in it, oh, the fattest cucumbers I've ever seen to this day was the first time I came here and planted in my garden. I've never seen anywhere that is the fattest cucumbers I've ever seen. Not in the stores, not in the farmer's market, nowhere on the planet have I ever seen cucumbers that fat. And you know the funny thing, with all that I'm putting in my garden now, I've never seen them like that ever again. So I don't know what it is. I don't know if because the people who lived here before me, they were not planting a garden for a while. So with the trees over the garden and all those leaves dropping there and piling up over the years and breaking down. I don't know what it is, but that year, oh my lord, those were some really, really fat cucumbers. So, yes, but worms, I don't really see a lot of worms in my garden. It is only since I started when I bought my first pound of worms, and the lady came and she put the worms in my compost bin, and then she put a small amount in my garden. So since then, because I'm always adding the organic matter to the garden, which I don't really do anymore. So because I used to do that, so the worms stay there and build up their population. So now pretty much I cannot dig anywhere without seeing the red wigglers, but I don't see a lot of regular earthworms. I see more red wigglers, which is a surprise. You would think that the regular earthworms would be the ones that you see a lot of, but that is not the case. I'm seeing more of the red wigglers. And even though it is said that the red wigglers cannot survive freezing, but I still see them in the garden. So I don't know if maybe because of all that organic matter, when it gets covered with the snow acts as an insulator for the organic matter that is there. So maybe that is how the worms, the red wigglers, are surviving. But whatever the case, they're finding ways to survive. Some of them, of course, do die, but they're surviving. But what I want to do now, this year, I'm going to release not the African night crawlers because their cocoons cannot overwinter, not in this region. So I'm not going to put the African night crawlers. So I have a few Canadian night crawlers that I put in there. And every time we go fishing and we have the extra African night Canadian night crawlers, I would release them in the garden. Hi Makia, hey, how are you? The funny thing though is that although each year when we go fishing I would put the Canadian night crawlers in the garden. I have never been fortunate enough to see one, except for once when I was relocating the kids' raised bed. Then I found two underneath there, but I've never been fortunate to see any of these Canadian night crawlers. So I don't know what the story is because I mean, they have a lot of organic matter and stuff, so why am I not seeing them? So this year, I'm going to be releasing what little Canadian night crawlers, sorry, whatever little Canadian night crawlers I have. Oh, but hi, backyard farming with Ashley. How are you? Well, I don't know if I'd call the start of my weekend great, but it is okay. Let's see. I'm starting my own worm farm. Been researching it for a while. Oh, awesome! Congrats. Have fun. If you have any question, of course, you can feel free to ask me. I'll be happy to answer what I can. Oh, thank you, Makiahe. Yeah, so I'm going to be releasing all of my Canadian night crawlers. They're a bit too tricky to raise, and what it takes to raise them, I'm not really interested in doing because I'd have to have extra work of trying to keep them cool, and that's not an option for me. Yeah. So I'm going to be releasing all of my Canadian night crawlers this spring as soon as it is warm enough. And then my European night crawlers, I'm going to be putting some in all of my raised beds and in the main garden. And then I'm going to be seeing if over the years, if I'm going to be seeing their population increasing, because that would be just awesome. Yes. Um, I know they will survive. The European night crawlers will do well. Let's see. Okay, honey saying greetings to backyard farming. Backyard farming says that's wonderful. Great live. Okay, thank you, my dear. Okay, saying hi to Han. Yeah, so much I have planned for this year. I'm still lagging behind when it comes to planning out my garden. Um I don't know where my time is going. It seems as if I have way too much to do. So up to now, I still haven't had the chance to sit down and really plan out my garden yet. Last year, this time, I was well on the way where planning my garden is concerned, but this year, for whatever reason, it's just taking forever. Yes, but I think what I'm gonna have to do is just try to set aside 15 minutes every now and then, every few days, and try to work on one of my raised beds or stuff like that. Because if not, I don't think I'm going to get it done. I need to also sort out my seeds. I haven't done that yet. Haven't gone through and seed what I have and what I need. So I'm looking forward to planting my, what is it called? Growing my own. Is it lipini or lupini? I don't know. I'm not sure, but yes, looking forward to growing it this year. I'm going to make a little container just for it. I've never seen it, never tasted it, never grown it or anything like that. So, oh, I wonder if I could do that as my single seed challenge. Then I would just grow one by itself and the rest I would grow somewhere else where it doesn't have to interfere with my single seed challenge. Since as it's the first time I'm going to grow it, I guess I could do that. Let's see. LP says, oh, okay, at least you can't add too much to your garden. Do you make worm tea? Sorry, I don't remember. Okay. Yes. Usually over the years I have not been making worm tea except for the last year I started. I did it the year before but not a lot. But last year I decided to do it more because the worm casting is great, it's awesome. But then when it comes to repelling pests off the plant, you can't really put the worm casting itself directly on the plant because it's going to fall off. It won't stay on the leaves. So you wouldn't really get the benefit if you apply it that way. So for that reason, to ensure that I get the best use out of it as a pest control, then I started making worm tea. And then with the curly top virus that my plants had last year, I decided that I'm going to be testing the worm tea to see if it would work to help the plant because you don't really cure curly top virus. There's no cure for it. But then the plants were just looking so depressed. So I used the worm tea. So between that and the worm castings, it really helped the plants. Thankfully, I was able to have an harvest. I wasn't really expecting one because of the way the plants were looking, but the worm tea does make a difference. So this year, I think I'm going to be making even more worm tea than usual because I can see where it really helps. And one of the thing is that the difference between the worm tea and the worm castings is that for the worm tea, especially when it comes to seedlings, it is very nice to use because to fertilize the plants because you don't necessarily have a lot of space in your seedling trays to be stocking up the worm castings. But then when you're watering your plants, if you use the castings to make the tea, then it's just one application and it does not pile up in your seedling trays. So that is one of the things that I really like about the worm castings. And then although the worm tea that is, and although the worm casting is slowly releasing its nutrients, When you make the worm tea, the nutrients is already absorbed into the liquid. So if you want a quick boost, then worm tea is faster than using the worm castings. Let's see. Growing my own. Okay. Backyard farming with Ashley says, hey, growing my own. Healthy says, backyard farming, your life will be better with a worm farm. Oh, absolutely. I cannot see myself gardening now without a worm farm. And as I think about the possibility of leaving this cold region and I'm thinking about my going somewhere warmer, I'm thinking, I don't care wherever I go, if I'm going anywhere. If I'm going somewhere warmer, my worms are tagging along. Even if it is the cocoons I'm taking with me, there is no way I'm going to be growing anything without my worms. I wouldn't use, I wouldn't trade it for anything else. Absolutely. No other form of fertilizer. Just think about it. Compost is awesome in your garden, but it doesn't offer as much nutrients as the worm castings. It does not offer the pest repelling properties that the worm castings offer. It doesn't help hailing plants the way worm tea or worm casting does. It does not have the amount of microbes. It has microbes, but it does not have the amount of microbes that the worm casting has. It does not burn plants. So when you look at the benefits and then you have to wait so long for your compost to be ready, but when you're doing the worms vermicomposting, you don't have to wait any long period of time. 3 months and you're good to go, and after the 3 months, pretty much every month after that you can be harvesting. So I definitely would not trade the worm farm for anything, for any other means of growing my plants. No, definitely. I can't see myself without it. Let's see. LP says that's a great idea, White Davy, for the single seed challenge. Okay, thanks. See, backyard farming says, yes, LP, I'm looking forward to having some worm tea. So, backyard farming, Ashley, when does your growing season start? Let's see. Anne says, LP, yes, I do, and use it to treat and feed my plants. My herb boxes love it. Good. LP says, White David, do you know how soon after spraying worm tea on plants you can eat them? I never really give thought to that. I've never really given thought to that. So I'll have to look into it. I'll just jot it down so I remember. Okay. Yes, I've never really looked into that, but that is a pretty good question. Let's see. Stacy says, I am using my worm tea on the base of all my plants. Okay. It's a good idea to put it on the foliage of your plants, not just the base, because a lot of pests that are on your plants, the worm tea can help with. So you want to use it not just on the base of your plant, but on the foliage of your plants. If it is a seedling, then fine. A young seedling, then you don't want to put it on the seedling, because if they're not strong enough, then the worm tea could damage the plants. But Once they reach the stage where they are strong enough, you want to use it on the foliage, because what happens is that the worm castings contains uh, chitin, and the worm, the what is it? The pest, some pest exoskeleton is made up of chitinase. So when you put the worm tea on these pests, what happens is that the chitin in the worm casting will break down the exoskeleton of these pests. So that is how it works as a pest repellent. So you want to use it on the foliage of your plants as well. Let's see, backyard garden says great information. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Stacy says I live in zone 7. So we start mid February transplanting the cool crops. Oh my goodness, girl, you are so fortunate. So when does your growing season end? Yes, our I'm in what, zone 3B. So my growing season doesn't start until the last week in May. Of course, if I'm doing cool weather crop, sometimes I might be able to put it outdoors the last week in April and beyond. But in general, the growing season actually start the last week, or at least our last frost date is the last week in May. Yes, Zone 7 is awesome. Let's see. LP says, okay, Zone 7, that's nice, Ashley. I'm Zone 6A. Okay. How long does your growing season last, LP? See, LP says, thank you. I keep hearing so much good about foliar spray, but then I wonder about feeding it to my birds and foods that are eaten raw and not cooked. I don't think it is much of a problem. Yes, I don't really think it is much of a problem. Definitely not for the birds. It is not a problem for the birds at all. For humans, I am not so sure, but I don't really see where it would be much of a problem either, but it is good to be sure. Yes, so let's see. Okay. Ashley says, well, my first date oh is November. I grow year round indoors also. Okay, so when you say you grow year round, does that mean in the winter you can grow outdoors too? That would be awesome. Where are you located, Ashley? Yeah, so in another few minutes, I'm going to be saying goodbye to you guys. As you know, my daughter is going to need to get back into the classroom for school, so I'm going to have to get out of here. CLP says normally our first frost is beginning of October, but this year we didn't get frost until the end of October, which is nice, which is very nice. Yeah, our first frost can occur anytime in September, and sometimes we do get it in August, like the latter part of August, but in 2019, no, in 2020, we got it the 8th of August. That was something else. Like by the 8th of August, most people in this region lost their garden except for their cool weather crop. I've never seen anything like that. And you know what's funny? When we first came here, May is always when we have the last frost. But then I was able to grow even corn, which is a warm weather crop. I had corns outdoors in October for several years. I would have corn out there. But then in the last 3 or so years, by September, you better know that you're going to take all of your heat loving plants out of the ground, or else you're not going to have them. So, so much has changed in the last 3 years. It is unbelievable the way the climate has changed. And it only seems to be getting worse because this year, well, last year, for the first time in 12 years, I don't know if it is longer than that, but I've only been here for 12 years. And for the first time since I've been here, we had temperatures that felt like minus 51 in December. That is so unusual. Usually we would get in the minus 20s in December or warmer. Minus 30s we used to get when we just came here. It would be like January, 1 week in January, a few days in January, or we'd get that in minus 30s for a week or so in February. But now we are getting like minus 40, feels like minus 50 in December, and it lasts for 3 weeks. And then this week we have temperatures, I think today is going to be 1 degree. So tell me about that. It's just absolutely crazy what's going on with the weather. So now I'm wondering, what is this growing season going to be like? Because last year we had it warming up very early, so everyone thought, oh, we're going to get an early spring, and then it got back cold. Some of the plants actually started sprouting, and then it got back cold. So a lot of plants were lost last year. And then we got snow in June for the first time since I've been here. We got snow one day in June, the first week in June. So the weather is just crazy, and there's nothing we can do about it. So, pretty much, I'm just going to try and see if I can come up with some ways to ensure that whatever comes, I'll be able to keep my garden going. Let's see, LP says they say May 4th is our last frost, but there's almost always another one after that. Okay, most folk around here put summer crop in June 1st. Okay, at least for those not frost hardy. Okay, you see, Ashley says, yes, I keep my cool crop out all winter. I'm in Maryland. Okay, well, that's nice. That's nice that you're at least able to have your cool weather crops growing all year round. Yes, so in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to be saying goodbye to you guys. So, thank you all for being here, for your participation. And I hope you guys are going to have a wonderful growing season this year, successful growing season, and happy worm farming. So, take care, and I hope to see you again on Monday.